On today's episode of Locked On NHL, we dive into big questions for the Seattle Kraken. Can they take the next step? Will the Winnipeg Jets contend this season? And which version of the Calgary Flames do we get this year? All that and more on today's episode. Let's get started.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into a Western Conference Tuesday edition of Locked On NHL, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any of our new episodes throughout the week. On today's episode of Locked On NHL, we dive into some big questions for the Seattle Kraken, the Winnipeg Jets, and the Calgary Flames, taking a look at if these teams can contend this season and, in the case of the Kraken, take that next step. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild and your host for Western Conference Tuesday here on Locked On NHL, joined by my co-host Nick Morgan of Locked On Predators. Nick, we continue the big questions series as we are getting closer to the start of training camp, preseason. We within the next week will have actual tangible hockey at our fingertips, and so we've made it through the off season, and it's hockey time.
I believe the first preseason games are now officially less than a week away. So we will actually see some players on the ice shoving each other into the boards. And, you may have already seen that if you're a fan of a team with a spicy training camp. But yeah, looking forward to it.
Now, our first team that we're going to talk about here for our big questions is a team who has seen their expectation level rise over the offseason. That, of course, is the Seattle Kraken, who, after their first year in the league, was a rough year for them trying to kind of figure it out after the expansion draft. Last year was not rough in the slightest, as the Kraken had just a huge jump in their points, in their goals, in every metric. They ended up making the playoffs. They ended up beating the Colorado Avalanche in the first round of the playoffs, only to be upended by the Dallas Stars. And so for Seattle, I guess my big question for them coming into the season is, can they take it another step? You have a superstar in Matty Beniers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you figure out what is going on with Shane Wright and add him to that mix and give kind of that bona fide 1-2 punch? And can they go from a team that won a round last year to a team that maybe wins 2 or 3 postseason series this year?
Yeah. You mentioned, what did the Kraken have to do for the next step? The thing that made the Kraken so good last year was depth. They had more scoring depth than any team in the NHL. They had 8 players with at least 40 points last year, and they had 13 players with at least 30 points. To put that in perspective, the New Jersey Devils, the kings of exciting offense, they only had 9 players with 30 plus points, and Tampa Bay only had 9. In Colorado, they had less than the Kraken did. So that tells you something about just how much depth scoring Seattle got. But to me, Seth, the thing that's going to make them a sustainable winner is they've got to find some of that depth. It's probably going to have to be Matty Beniers and figure out, how do we make these players elite? We've seen that a lot of teams where, you have a lot of really good teams, solid players up and down the lineup, but the ones that really thrive, the ones that win year in, year out, are always at the top of the standings, are the ones that have maybe 1 or 2 elite players at the top of the lineup. Colorado went from a good team to a great team when Cale Makar and Nathan MacKinnon really took their games to the next level. All those years, the New Jersey Devils had good prospects. Jack Hughes became elite last year, and you saw that the Devils finally had some of their first sustained success. So that's going to be the big question for the Seattle Kraken is, okay, we have players. We have plenty of great players on this team. Who's going to be, the 90-point guy that's going to take over games, late in games, that's going to win some playoff series, that's going to be the Conn Smythe front runner as Seattle marches to the playoffs? You mentioned Matty Beniers. That's a good one. They also have a guy named Shane Wright in the system, Seth. One of the most oft talked about players over the past 2 years or so in terms of prospects. It's going to be interesting to see what his deal is this year.
Yeah, and a guy who was, I think, heralded as one of the next superstars in this league. It did not work out in his first action at the NHL level, and so then he spent a good majority of the year at the AHL level. Does he take that step this year? Does he become a consistent producer with that Kraken team? That's a massive question for this team. But now that I look at it, I think there is another question that is going to be a big one for the Seattle Kraken this year. You had the goalie tandem of Martin Jones and Philipp Grubauer this past season, and Grubauer, after signing that big deal with the Kraken, 17, 14, and 4 this past season. The Kraken collectively had an 890 save percentage throughout the course of the regular season. They leaned on Martin Jones throughout most of the season. Philipp Grubauer performed well in that series against the Colorado Avalanche. So can he take some of that success from that series, bottle it, and translate it into the regular season this year? If not, that's going to be an interesting goalie situation to watch as the season unfolds.
They're going to need somebody to do it because it's, what they got last year, especially during the regular season, I would say just isn't good enough for a contending team. And that tells you maybe just how good that Seattle defense was last year. Martin Jones had an 887 save percentage, Philipp Grubauer an 895 save percentage, and the Kraken still had 100 points last year. Those are the type of figures that you see from goaltenders on teams that are in the bottom 5 of the league. So the fact that the Kraken defense have played well in front of those two goalies and have sort of limited the damage and limited the shots that they've had to face. Credit to the Seattle defense. I don't think we talk enough about that Seattle defense last year, Seth. We talk about Vince Dunn, who finally got some Norris votes. I think a lot of people saw him, but you also had Adam Larson, whose name has kind of been a joke ever since that Taylor Hall trade. Really stepped it up last year in terms of his two-way game. Jamie Alexiak is somebody that I always think has been kind of an underrated defenseman. And there's just a couple of really good, kind of guys on the team last year, even somebody like Will Borgen. And then, this year, how do you replace Carson Soucy? So that's going to kind of be another big thing to watch for the Kraken, is if that defense plays as well as it did last year, maybe get some good goaltending. That's going to be, the Kraken are going to be a tough team to beat if that keeps up this year as well.
Yeah, and I think the expectation is that the Kraken will contend for a postseason spot. The next team that we're going to talk about, who knows? We don't really know what to expect from the Winnipeg Jets, and so we'll dive into that as we continue today's episode of Locked On NHL after this. With storms, shortages, pandemics, reliance on China, and supply chain issues, we need to be prepared now more than ever. And Jace Medical can give you peace of mind when disaster strikes. The process for Jace Medical is simple. You go online, fill out a form, and then you get prescription life-saving medications right to your door. The Jace case gives you peace of mind so that you're not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Medical makes sure you have the medication in hand. You can save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at checkout on jacemedical.com. Again, you can save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at checkout on jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code locked on. Roll into the NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's all it takes is a clean, crisp $5 bill, and you get $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time to get in on the action. The app is super easy to use. For me, as a Vikings fan, it's been super easy for me to place bets on the Vikings the first 2 weeks of the season while seeing all of my bets not cash. But hey, that's okay because I still have well over that bonus bets range to use on other things such as spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So make sure you visit fanduel.com/locked on and kick off the NFL season right. Again, fanduel.com/locked on. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On NHL, a Western Conference Tuesday edition of Locked On NHL. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Continuing our big questions for Western Conference teams. We talked about the Seattle Kraken to start, and now we will talk about the Winnipeg Jets, a team that made a few moves in the offseason. Nick, with a few more moves, it seems like on the horizon. So one of the big things for me is this team in year 2 under Rick Bowness one that can contend, or is this where we see them start to take a more aggressive step back as the season unfolds?
That kind of depends on what you think about their offseason, Seth, because they got rid of Pierre-Luc Dubois, but got some pretty good depth pieces back in terms of Alex Iafallo, Rasmus Kupari, and I can't remember the third part of that trade. Was that Kaliev? Arthur Kaliev?
I think
Is that him
so.
or is that somebody else? Yeah. Sorry, Winnipeg Jets fans, for not tracking your depth signings this offseason. Look, it's interesting because it felt like something had to change in Winnipeg. My big thing was just sort of, all of the talk in the offseason. It's for we've kind of heard like rumors about, the locker room not really gelling for the past like 3-4 seasons. We've heard, kind of talk about, the players and the management and coaches kind of butting heads. The kind of spoke volumes when you let Blake Wheeler go this offseason, lost his captaincy last year. There's some other, longer term pieces from that team gone over the past couple of years. You can kind of feel like maybe the culture is, something that needs to be addressed in Winnipeg. From that standpoint, it just seems like this is just maybe the first of more moves coming from the Winnipeg Jets. Connor Hellebuyck says he's, I guess if you believe some of the rumors coming out of Winnipeg, asked them to, kind of rescind his trade request. So he's here for one more year, but he's a free agent after this year. So what's that going to, look like? And I don't know. It just seems like, I don't know about you, Seth, but it seems like most of the storylines around the Jets are kind of in the front office and off the ice rather than, what's going to happen with the Jets on the ice. And that's not necessarily a good sign. And it's kind of disappointing because the Jets do have a lot of good players on this team too.
They do, and you hit it right on the head. It's never a good sign when a majority of the chatter about your team is not related to the on-ice product, because that's where the distractions can kind of come into play. And I mean, Rick Bowness at the end of the season saying that his team played terribly and that there was a need for guys to give more. and they knew who they were. That didn't vibe well with a lot of the vets on the team, and we've seen some of them be moved since. The big question for me is if this season goes south, what happens with Connor Hellebuyck and with Mark Scheifele, who are still there, but beyond this season, you really don't know what is going to happen with them. There have been kind of some rumors that Hellebuyck just was absolutely not going to resign. And it kind of seems like the same way for Scheifele. And so if the Jets are going to get anything for those guys, they're going to have to do it at the trade deadline. Otherwise, they run the risk of having even more chatter from their front office, letting those two guys go for nothing, which would, I don't think, if you are a fan of the Winnipeg Jets and you know that those guys are likely not going to be back, that's not acceptable to not get anything back for them and just let them walk in free agency. So that's a huge one to watch as well, because there's going to come a point where, if this season goes south, those guys are going to get moved.
Yeah, and that's going to be one of those questions that, let's say the Jets get to the trade deadline and they're, just inside of a wild card spot. Or, maybe just on the outside looking in. If you're the Jets brain trust, do you look at that and go, okay, like this is, it's our last chance with this core. Like, let's load up, let's go for it. Let's kind of make a run here. Not unlike what the Columbus Blue Jackets did a few years ago when they knew Panarin and Bobrovsky were bailing after the season. Or do they look and it's like, okay, like, this is the point we're calling it. Like, we're not going to get any better than this. We got to tear this thing down and see what we can get for some of our big guns.
It'll be interesting to see because you could see the Winnipeg Jets kind of get a new lease on life after those trades and get out to the start that they did last year. That's what they're hoping. They're hoping that they don't get the team in the second half that could not win a game to save their lives. And so we'll see which one we get. Much like the next team. The next team, we have no idea which version we're going to get. And so we'll discuss the Calgary Flames and what to expect from them as we continue today's episode of Locked On NHL after this.
Today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Look, if anything around the world the past couple of years has taught us, it's that everyone should be empowered to take care for themselves and their loved one during the unexpected. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of unexpected that's popped up here recently. And that's why Jace Medical offers the Jace case. The Jace case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use and gives you a peace of mind so that you're not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency. Jace Medical makes sure you have the medication in hand. Jace Medical is simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication, delivery, and ongoing consulting and care. Don't get caught unprepared. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using code LOCKEDON at checkout at jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code LOCKEDON.
One final segment of today's episode of Locked On NHL, a Western Conference Tuesday edition. Thank you for tuning in as always. Seth Toupal and Nick Morgan finishing things out, talking about the Calgary Flames. Nick, 17 overtime losses for the Calgary Flames last year. They end up moving on from Daryl Sutter. Not a surprise because there were a lot of points at which the Flames looked like they hadn't practiced in a very long time. And then we come to find out that that was a regular occurrence, especially on special teams, that they didn't work on anything throughout the course of the season. Yeah. And so the big question for me for this Calgary Flames team is, will a new voice at head coach be enough of a difference for them to contend this season?
All I heard out of that was that I need to see Daryl Sutter doing the Allen Iverson practice rant, complete with the white baseball cap and chain. I didn't need to know that I need to see anything more in my life than that right there. You mentioned Daryl Sutter gone. Hey, let's also not forget that Brad Treliving is gone too. Craig Conroy is now the new GM. So you kind of got a new man in charge in the front office too. And there's going to be some big questions for this Calgary Flames club. To me, Seth, the biggest thing is just, is this going to be, kind of the group of players that we saw 2 years ago, put up some big numbers? Of course, Matthew Tkachuk's not there, but, Jonathan Huberdeau is there, who had, a 116-point season just 2 years ago. Or are we going to get the team that we got last year, where everybody just grossly underperformed? Their leading scorer, Tyler Toffoli, is gone. So, you're going to need the Elias Lindholms of the world to get back to where they were 2 years ago. Nazem Kadri, I would say a disappointing first season in Calgary. Jonathan Huberdeau went from, 110 points plus to 55 last year. That's not good. And then you look in goal, Seth, and Jacob Markstrom, who a lot of people were saying maybe one of the 3-4 best goalies in the NHL a couple of years ago, abysmal last year. Not just like an off season, but liability bad. So it's going to be interesting to see which version of the Calgary Flames are we going to get. Are we going to get those group of players from 2 years ago that stepped up and made the Flames look like one of the more dangerous teams in the NHL? Or are we going to get last year's team? We're just, a couple of big names that underperformed. And the answer to that probably tells you which direction the Flames are going to go as a franchise, as Conroy starts to put his stamp on how he wants to build this thing.
Let's talk a little bit more about Jonathan Huberdeau, because that's another big question. There were reports that he did not get along with Daryl Sutter last year. Goes from 30 goals 2 seasons ago to 15, 85 assists to 40, 115 total points to 55. He ended up having 38 power play points 2 years ago to 15. And so we're not talking about just a guy who, didn't live up to expectations in his first year in a new environment. We're talking about the roller coaster car went over the hill and there just was no track after that. And so it's a legitimate concern, because is it just that he was that bad of a fit in Daryl Sutter's system, or now that he is 30 years old, is Father Time knocking on the door a little early and saying, "Hey, am I early to the party, or can I still come in?" Huberdeau is a huge question mark for this team, because if they're going to do anything this year, they have to get him back to even if he's 80% of what he was that final year for Florida. That's still a massive, massive part of what they're trying to do. And if he doesn't live up to that, yikes.
Well, to be fair to Jonathan Huberdeau, I don't probably could count on one or two hands how many people actually did get along with Daryl Sutter
Very true.
at any point in his career. For the Flames' sake, I hope they figure out Jonathan Huberdeau, because they got 7 more years of him locked up. His new contract kicks in this year. So it's almost, I kind of feel like, Seth, that the Flames don't really have a choice. Like, this is their guy. They kind of have to go all in. And, they bring in, a new head coach. That's going to kind of be the thing, is how do you unlock what Jonathan Huberdeau brings to this team? You got to look a little bit at, what he did in Florida and his role there and how he was used. Because that's kind of your guy that you're locked in, and that's what Ryan Huska is going to be. That's his first big task as head coach, is trying to kind of build around him, because as of right now, that's your best offensive threat. Nazem Kadri. I think we knew it was kind of far-fetched to think he was going to keep putting up the numbers like he did that 1 year in Colorado. Elias Lindholm reportedly has kind of asked out, or is at least non-committal about being with the Flames long-term. So I don't really know if you're going to be able to rely on him. Huberdeau's your guy. Like, that's the guy that you need to get, be kind of a 100-point pace guy. So if Ryan Huska can figure out how to unlock it, then yeah, like maybe the Flames get back to where they were a few years ago, and all of a sudden they're looking like a dangerous team in a, kind of weak Pacific Division, or weaker, I should say. And if not, then these Flames are going to have a lot of issues to work through over the next couple of years or so in terms of how they want to build this roster moving forward.
Yeah, and if he's not able to unlock Jonathan Huberdeau, I think priority number 2 for Ryan Huska is fundamentals. I've never seen a team struggle with just basic things and also find ways to lose. Finding ways to lose games, it's almost as if, and I'm saying this 100% in jest, it's almost as if they were trying to do it to get Daryl Sutter run out of town, because
not a bad strategy.
and it worked.
Can't hate it. Yeah.
It did its job, because there were so many games that it felt like they just had in hand, and all of a sudden you look up and you're like, how they just had a 2-goal lead? How is it now 4-2 the other way? So fundamentals, and I'm sure the players will appreciate actually having focus on those types of things, but there's a lot of work to do in Calgary regardless, and hopefully Mr. Huska got a good start on it, because he's got some work to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's going to be interesting, because hey, like let's say Markstrom is back to where he was, or another wild card, Dustin Wolf makes, kind of takes the job, and as good as a lot of people say he is, Flames answer, their goaltending questions. They get some of the scoring back. It's not out of question the Flames make some noise in the Western Conference next year, Seth.
Time will tell. And for more of these types of questions, make sure you tune into tomorrow's episode of Locked On NHL, where it will be an Eastern Conference edition of Big Questions. You can hear about some of the biggest questions facing the best teams in the Eastern Conference, as well as our continued look at Western Conference teams each Tuesday as part of Locked On NHL. Make sure you follow along and subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the course of the week. And make sure to follow myself and Nick as we cover the Minnesota Wild and Nashville Predators, respectively, as part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We've got new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.